very convinced that the ways cities take shape is profoundly everybody's business. Everybody should be involved in that and have their say in that. And also, when you're not a politician or not an urban planner or engineer or an investor or developer.
That was the voice of Sofie van Bruystegem, one of two guests of today's show. Welcome back to the Cities Reimagined Podcast, the show where we challenge conventional paradigms of doing urbanism and discuss alternative futures. I'm your voice of choice, Johannes Riegler, and it is really cool that you decided to listen to this show once more. I'm now recording this intro a couple of days after the launch of Cities Reimagined, and I have to say that I'm blown away with all the feedback and responses I got from all of you. So this is really encouraging for me to keep on going and to continuing improving the show and also improve my personal capabilities with recording and cutting podcast and holding the space in interviews. So thank you so much to everybody who reached out. Please keep the feedback coming and let me know about your wishes and what you expect from this show as well. So I'm back now from spending a couple of days in Bologna, Italy at the Public Space Academy workshop. Luisa Bravo, who you might know from the last episode on reimagining public space, invited me to get over there and give a talk on regenerative urbanism and how urban public spaces can reinforce the strong human-nature connection and why that connection is actually needed. And it was really nice to go to Bologna again, meet friends and colleagues from around the world. And I think Luisa did a fabulous job of setting up the Public Space Academy. And it was the first on-site workshop in the terms of Public Space Academy. So watch out for the next one. Hopefully be there next year. I'm back in Vienna now for a couple of days before heading out to Madrid to spend some 10 days there. And in fact, I was living in Madrid in 2011 for a couple of months, and it was a very interesting time to be in Madrid because Spain was suffering at that time from a large-scale housing crisis, which was triggered by the bursting of the country's housing bubble. So the economy was struggling and unemployment soared, and many people in Spain found themselves unable to afford their homes, which led to widespread foreclosures and evictions. So in this very frustrating and desperate environment at the time, the Occupy movement gained momentum, resulting in the occupation of protesters and activists of Madrid's iconic Plaza del Sol in May 2011. And that was the space where protesters rallied against the government's housing policies, demanding affordable housing and an end to the foreclosure epidemic. So the square was occupied for weeks, and protesters actually installed temporary infrastructure on this very touristic square, including libraries and childcare. And it was an extremely fascinating and interesting form of protest, a very positive one, a very constructive one, to witness this reimagination of space, which manifested as a call for social change and economic change in Spain. Since then, I haven't had the opportunity to follow urbanism or urban stuff in Madrid. So if you have any hints on what is going on in the city nowadays, I would be very happy if you would let me know to check that out over the next days. So this personal anecdote about my experience in Madrid is actually a good segue to today's topic of reimagining just cities. So when we or people in our sphere talk about reimagining urban areas and cities, too often certain groups of society are left out and overlooked in the process. In this regard, some of the most inspiring people I met over the years are Jim Segers and Sofie van Bruystegem from the Brussels-based NGO CityMine. So since 97, CityMind is questioning those urban paradigms, leaving people, especially those with low social economic resources and power, out of city making. CityMind, in that regard, is a middle organization, somewhere in the middle between social, artistic, but also in the middle between residents, commuters, artists, investors, policymakers, and therefore they are seen as a medium through which all of these organizations can communicate. So in October 2022, I had the chance to visit Jim and Sofie in one of the neighborhoods they are working in, and they showed me around and showed me their projects and told me a lot of stories of people living in the neighborhood, but also how they work with these communities. So Jim and Sofie really show a high energy in their work, and they are continuously evolving with their practices. And it seems they are never standing still, but they also not only challenge urban practices, but they also challenge their own role in it. And this is something we can all learn from. So I'm very, very happy to have Jim and Sofie in one of the first episodes of Cities Reimagined, because I think their work is just on point for this show. So let's get to it. Hi, Jim and Sofie. So great to have you on Cities Reimagined. How are you doing?
We're good, fine. And we're very happy to be invited. Thanks.
It's an honor.
The first time I got to know the work of CityMine was when I was living in Brussels for my studies back in 2009. And I was doing this 4 Cities Urban Studies program. And back then, this program organized a meeting or a visit with you or your colleagues. I actually cannot recollect who we met. It might have been you, Sofie. But the years went by and I moved away from Brussels soon after that. And I came back quite often for work. So I had the chance to see somehow what is going on in Brussels, in the city, and talk to many people involved in changing the city. And I had the chance to talk to them regularly. Then years later, our paths somehow crossed again as we started talking and exchanging from time to time on different things, among them also how to design European programs focused on urban research and innovation in ways that they can be attractive to grassroots organizations, non-governmental organizations, neighborhood initiatives, social innovators, and so on. And at the same time, you were granted a project funded by the JPI Urban Europe, the program I'm working with, which brought us together again. And when I thought of people to invite for the Cities Reimagined podcast for the first season of the podcast, I actually immediately thought about you because you have so many interesting stories to tell.
Wow.
And I really find your work highly inspiring. But can you tell us a little bit the story behind CityMind and what you do, and why do you do what you do?
Wow. And then in 45 minutes, Johannes. What we do is maybe where we come from is a more interesting point, I think. In late 1990s, we realized that there's a very interesting field between arts and activism that inspired us a lot to do things at that time in public space. Public space being very both contested and very lacking in Brussels, particularly in deprived urban areas. So we saw an opportunity to do things there and involve local communities, local residents. Ever since, CityMind changed a lot. At the time, those who started CityMind had a background in activism. And what I always, in hindsight, think is that before CityMind, we were part of those activists that often resist change, stop things from happening, stop large urban developments from taking place. And then with CityMind, maybe already more positive, we reacted to change, very much a policy position where you say something's happening and we need to do something about it. We don't need to stop it, we need to do something about it. And now I think since 2010-12 with CityMind, we're in a third phase, what I call anticipating change, where I think that it would be very interesting to find out what will happen soon, the transitions we need, and how can we as citizens, individuals, groups, communities play a part in those changes. So those three stages for me are very distinct within the development of CityMind. For the moment, I describe ourselves as at the crossroads of architecture, urbanism, and urban activism still, which shows the political side, the research interest, and the creative, the maker side. But maybe Sofie has another take on that.
Well, yeah, to me, the bottom, of course, CityMind has been set up end of the 90s. And so we're almost 25 years now from there. And cities are places that change. So naturally, our work focused on how cities take shape changes. A wasteland that offered a lot of possibilities at one point now is constructed and developed. So we're not the ones who are going to chain them themselves to resist and to keep that wasteland as a place of opportunity. That's not what we do in that frame. You framed that very well. So to me, that's very logical that our focuses change. But the bottom line has always been and is still very important. And has been always very important, is that we're very convinced that the ways cities take shape is profoundly everybody's business. Everybody should be involved in that and have their say in that. And also, when you're not a politician or not an urban planner or engineer or an investor or developer, as it is right now, they decide how it's shaped often. And so we want to challenge that. And that's to me, that's always been the conviction and the great motivation. Yeah, I think that's basically it. What we really like to do then is to create spaces where we can really go deep into a certain topic that is related to environmental change, most oftenly sustainable development-ish things come up very often the last few years, like water, like energy, like things that nobody questions, that need some thinking and need some change. And so in the spaces we create, there can be very tangible spaces in a neighborhood, very, very locally rooted spaces. Or it can be organizational models where we invite people around the table, people with very different views on the topics. Like, we really give ourselves the luxury and the people involved the luxury to look at things from every angle. And people are not used to that. And that often gives you insights you didn't expect. You often meet like unusual suspects, people with expertise that is recognized. They often come in our project processes like, okay, they have a way like, okay, I'm the all-knowing one, I've been invited and I'm feeling generous, sharing my knowledge with you and shining my light on you. And then you see them change attitudes when they hear about other expertise from unexpected angles. Like, for instance, bioengineers in a water project, they really changed their way of talking when they bumped into people living on boats who have everyday knowledge about purifying water, getting access to water because they don't have streaming water in their boats, etc. And then you can start talking and start seeing things differently. And so that's our great pleasure, I think, to create these spaces and to create these encounters and to try to see things differently.
Wow. And I really like what you described, Jim, or also Sofie, this transition from where you started as CityMind as being an activist group. And I think you were also involved in the occupation of the train station in front of the European Parliament in the early 2000s, right? Which was also a very different time back then. You know, it was pre 9/11. It was Geneva and Seattle. What was it? G20 protests were going very strong. It was a
G7 at the time.
Yeah, G7 at that time. How did you, I mean, you described how you developed that with CityMind more towards a positive way of working with the communities. How did you or how do you perceive that change on a larger level within city making? Is that something only CityMine incorporated to work more co-creatively, or do you perceive that for example, the city Brussels also more and more reaches out and lets different voices into the development process of projects?
We like to think we invented it all, including grain circles and everything, but that wasn't us. No. There is a shift. There is an awareness that you can't cast the citizens' opinion just aside and ignore it, and that's a good thing. There's a lot of powers that be talking the talk, not walking the walk, which makes it very frustrating for us. And since it is our bread and butter, it's what we do every day, I think we tend to be very in the cutting edge of this discussion, and then being very disappointed when the broader field is not following. That was very abstract, wasn't it?
It kind of was, yeah.
Just you find somebody to make a drawing with that. No, what I was trying to say is that there are certain words that recurrent over those 25 years who cover the same semantic field, probably, that is about doing things together, about involving those who tend to be excluded. And it used to be called inclusion or participation. And I'm not sure that the word co-creation is so new. For us, it's just another way of saying the same thing, because the word participation got worn out for some reason. And so concretely, I think there's a shift, but I think there's still a lot of way to go. Let me try to make that more tangible, put some flesh on that skeleton. Take, for instance, on energy, where to us, it looked almost self-evident that if you aspire a transition towards greener, more local energy consumption, that you would also imagine ways of doing that in the poorer areas of cities, in the more popular areas, and that this could potentially be, considering the fact that local green energy is cheaper, that this could be a lever to also emancipate groups and involve them in the discussion, on the condition that you inform them, that they know what they're doing. We learned in hindsight that all the extra we put onto that is not what governments are interested in. If we can say we create a community that uses green local energy, fine, done, checked. For us, it's very hard, and that's when in the warm-up discussion, we talked about contextualizing our work. That is a big job that needs doing. This almost changing the paradigm of how we look at the problem, let alone how we deal with it. And that is the big struggle we are in front of, I think.
I think it comes down to the thing that when you're talking about something that is difficult now, at best people get to answer some questions. Like the experts analyze the field and they ask questions, and then you can participate in answering those questions. But we strongly believe, and we work towards a way that people could ask the questions themselves, define what is problematic, what is the bifurcation that you're in front of, and see what options you have actually, and make choices in them. And I think that's basically it. And that's, so we start at -10 when you talk about the process of participation. We try to go way before that.
I had the chance to hear you talk about your projects a couple of times, especially on energy communities, which is very inspiring, also for many people. I mean, Jim, you presented that at the launch of the Driving Urban Transition Partnership conference last year. And after the presentation, I heard many policymakers and others in the room talk about that presentation because it stuck with them, because it was something different, and they found it extremely important. Yet you described that it's difficult to make people realize the value of this line of work. That was just a comment. Can you describe a little bit how you work with the energy communities in a disadvantaged neighborhood? What do you do, and how do you work with the people there?
We in 2018, we were we had a great feel about doing something on the topic of energy. It was because of previous projects and because of reading in the media, etc., and people getting solar panels and us thinking, okay, but in cities it doesn't work one-on-one. You have your house and your roof, you put your solar panels on, it's solved, because my house puts a shade on my neighbor's house, so he can't do anything anymore. That's not the idea. We were talking about it, reading about it. We just nestled our offices in the Midi neighborhood in Brussels, which is very dense, very diverse. There's a lot of people living below the poverty threshold, but there's also a lot of younger people with a lot of resources coming here. So it's very mixed, and there's a very lively association network. So we thought it would be nice to try things in this neighborhood, and let's talk about energy. And by doing all the chats, and then we met a lot of experts in different fields, and somebody talked about the infrastructure, like the high tension coming to the cities and then goes below the streets, and there it's transformed in low voltage and distributed to. One cabin distributes it to like 100 or 150 households. So actually, you are linked as a neighborhood by cables. You can't see it, and you collaborate on these cables without knowing it. And so that was an eye-opener to us, like, okay, this energy thing and these very intangible things that happen behind the socket, they actually make pre-existing communities. And so that would be really nice to work with, like contacting people and saying, hey, you're my cable neighbor. When you put on your water kettle and I do it too, then we collaborate in a way on the cables. Maybe we can talk together about energy and the use of energy and where it comes from, and maybe we can do something meaningful. So to us, that was a starting point, something that was very made sense to us, and the way we approach these complex things by making them very tangible. And so, of course, there's a lot of energy cooperatives already in Belgium and in a lot of European places, places in Europe, I mean. But it's most of all people already convinced that climate change is something you need to be dealing with and taking action, and people who believe in their agency, and not the neighbors from the Midi neighborhood, for instance. And so to us, we really wanted to know how the energy reality of our neighbors here would lead us to, where it would lead us to. And so, as you said, Jim, before, the new player in the energy market, which are the energy communities, they are really a lever to involve people in important topics, like how are we gonna produce our energy? Are we gonna do it ourselves? Can't we do it more locally and cheaper and greener? And so for us, that was an ideal situation to really go to the neighbors and talk about the new possibilities with them, and to involve them in trying to make a concrete energy community project.
But by your work, by doing so, you also kind of connect between the big picture, the global crisis, the climate, biodiversity, and so on crisis, and the need to change, and the very local, everyday life of people in Brussels, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think these global questions, they land somewhere also. And so what we like, of course, we talk about it, we read about it, we think about it, we sometimes panic about it, we sometimes laugh about it. But when you see at the very small scale, okay, how does that impact this neighborhood and these people, you and me here right now? What does it do to us, and how can we deal with it? I think that makes it very interesting and very freeing also. Like, okay, if you see only the bigger picture, then you're stuck. But actually here and now we can do things.
Absolutely. It really tries to, your work really breaks that complexity down on the very local level. And that's why I find it so inspiring.
Well, I think really what I've been working with a group of social tenants in one social housing block, because that was the least complex way of trying to set up a first pilot project on energy sharing. It was the most clear frame of doing that. And so we said, okay, well, let's try to really set up how energy will be shared in this block with the tenants around the table from day one. And so the engineers were like, it's complex. They're not going to be interested. But yeah, why not? Let's try. It's a pilot. And so people were very happy about having this. They felt that they were given vertrouwen, zeg je dat?
Trust.
Yeah, it was a very important question, and they felt that they were trusted somewhere to think about it and to try to understand the complexity of it and to make choices in it. And so we learned a lot together. We had to learn the nitty-gritty of energy sharing, which is still very complex, but we managed to do so. So people got really the idea that they could have something to say in it. And so we made propositions to the landlord on how the energy sharing would take shape, and they were accepted. And so they were like, oh my God, I have a voice and this voice is worth listening to, because they are used to being marginalized and being helped. And even if it's not very explicit, that's an attitude you adopt also. And so they were like, oh, we're an organized group now, and we understood what it's about, and we understood the opportunities for us. And so, yeah, that's really something important, and that's really a shift in people's heads that I believe is crucial if we want to make a change. And Brussels, for instance, in the regions, is a region with 1 in 3 people almost living in energy poverty. So if we want to make an energy transition happen that makes sense and that is tailor-made to the needs of Brussels, then it would be really silly to not involve their visions on how energy should be brought to their house and used, and etc.
Right. So your work really tries to make cities better, or better places to live for everyone, I would say. And yet there tend to be challenges along the way, because you as an organization don't fall into one category, I would say.
Well, yeah, let me first take you by the hand.
Yeah.
and in my train of thought, which left off a while ago. The thing is, you mentioned a few crises, and I think one of the things that always strikes me is who has the right to prioritize crises, who has the right, the power to say, now this crisis is the most relevant. Apparently somebody could decide that last winter the energy crisis was topping all other crises, whereas the winter before it was a global virus that was the top crisis. So we're working with a community who was always on the receiving end of these discussions. They're not involved. And I think what was mentioned before is one of the things we try to do is create spaces where those powers are a bit questioned, shuffled, sometimes even switched off. And that's why, as Sofie was saying, we often work in in-between spaces, in places we create. You yourself mentioned the railway station. Those are spaces that escape regulation very often. And recently I got very inspired by this thought by Buckminster Fuller, obviously one of our patron saints, who said that it was the same thing with seafaring people. They left off on the sea because it's an unregulated area. They could do whatever they want, and they developed new practices, new ways of doing. And the most relevant ones were picked up on land. They were taken over and they became the standard way of doing things. But many of them just disappeared and were never talked of. And I recognize that a lot in what we do at CityMine. We create spaces where regulation is put on hold for a tiny bit, where we can experiment, explore, give those who don't have much to say, for a brief interval, the same right to speak as those who normally decide, and then see what comes out. The focus we give it, and that comes back to your question now, is we like to say we're a design practice. we make stuff. And the making, we call it prototypes, because that is the word that people use now. The people who have the money recognize the word prototype, and that's fine. We used to call it intervention, but it doesn't work anymore. The prototype is not decided in advance. And that brings me back to your previous question, like, what is the difficulty of getting this work funded? That is, when we say we co-create, we're serious about co-creating. We know the starting point. We know the broad dream, that is maybe within the large energy field, there is a practice to develop that levels that playing field between those who just consume energy and those who make energy. And they can, one of the things is to constantly talk about those who use energy and not consume them, because that already shifts the way of thinking. We all use it. And then from those, we mean it when we say we want to co-create, meaning the starting point is known. We explore together with all those partners. That means that the one who's at the table because he gave the money needs to be prepared to question the outcome again, to say we don't know where we'll end. We know together that we'll develop practices that are meaningful, from which we'll learn, which we'll put on every stage at the end, because we think it's important to have those people involved. But we can't promise you that. If we would promise it, that wouldn't be co-creation, that would be execution. And that, I think, is the very difficult thing. We make a lot of things, some of them are relevant, but we can't promise in advance that this will be the one. Now, that was a deep thought, wasn't it?
That was a deep thought. So, but still, it is, I really love how you describe how you are spanning boundaries between or of the given system, which of these paradigms we are working in. You with this metaphor of the man, most of the time man, going to the sea, exploring what is out there, what is possible, and making that. I really love that metaphor. Explore the sea and then see what's out there and make it included into your practice. But coming back to your work on a very local ground, by pushing these boundaries and spanning these boundaries, you must run into a lot of challenges, very practical challenges.
Well, there's practical challenges, and Sofie will come up with a few in a minute, I hope. But on a larger level, I think the challenge we come across at the level of a project is the same challenge you come across at the level of organizing a city. Is the same challenge you come across at organizing a family. That is, how do you deal with conflict, with difference of opinion? And I think what could be interesting in the projects we do is we make certain conflicts very explicit. And we confront people who are used to deciding that people can disagree. And so I think the ultimate transition goal should be finding new practices of organizing rather than a better laid out 15-minute circular city. It's how do we deal with the conflicts? How do we respect other opinions and come to a shared conclusion rather than imposing or have a majority vote? Because it's the whole problem with referenda, where if 51% decides something, it's decided, whereas 49% is disappointed. So for me, the ultimate challenge, scale of a project, scale of a family, scale of a city, scale of a continent, is how do we deal with conflict? Now, on a more practical level, I think the energy community, and that's why Sofie can explain that better, it's not about finding a group and setting up an energy community. You come with a lot of things you need to learn, and that, I think, was an interesting experience in Sun City in particular.
Yeah, what I was thinking about more, what is most common in the different projects we did and the different topics we talked about is that we need to learn to speak a lot of languages, actually, because there's the expert view, the recognized expert view. And so it's important to us to talk together and to understand how the landscape in water or in energy is shaped right now, and what are the cracks maybe in that, or the over-regulated or the under-regulated zones in them, because that's, I think, that they come close to the in-between spaces Jim was already talking about. we also want to hear our neighbors, our cable neighbors, when we're talking about energy, and they don't speak that language, of course. Mm-hmm. And so that comes to words, but that also comes to invitations you send. If it's too designed, then a lot of our neighbors will think it's not for them. Or if we make it too like simple, our more designer neighbors will think it's not for them, and we want to have them all around the table. So we're always trying to work around these different realities, and so we have to come up with different stories, different angles, so that's a big part of our work. It takes a lot of time. We love doing that, that's not the problem, but so it's very slow, and if you want to start broad enough, then it takes time. And so that's I think something that is difficult to make people understand, that this is key to the work, and that you really need to have the courage to take that time and to give us some confidence that something will come out of that. And so that's a very practical difficulty. Then also when things are running and you have people willing to do something together, or when you have a group coming together to create a very concrete action or a very concrete prototype building or something, then of course you have we always call them like we have the craziest people coming over first, because people are not used to open spaces, and people are not used to being free and being able to contribute to the rules about how the process is going to take shape. And so that's when you come to also how to deal with that, and how to keep it open enough but not conflictuous, or there's also people more from the activist groups maybe, who are used to having very long discussions in long meetings, but a lot of people don't have time for that. But we also want to involve them, and there's a lot of people who are not interested in meetings. They want to do things, and while doing things you talk to them and have information about them. So that's also something we need to really take into account. And so of course we need to organize get-togethers and meetings around the table and talking, but we also need to organize get-togethers out there in neighborhoods and do things, and just maybe dig a pond somewhere and while digging you can have people telling you amazing things about this space where you're digging, and how it was shaped, and the tensions and the questions and the good things about it.
That's also crucial, I think, if you want to make sure that everybody decides on certain issues, that they're informed about those issues. And that's often a mistake that's been made, that we've been told very often that you don't want to involve citizens in decisions on energy. They don't know enough about it. Whereas I think the challenge we took on was to, okay, then we'll inform them. And by creating this non-regulated space, we had the self-confidence, let's say, to say to experts, well, explain it to them then. Teach them if you and that's very confronting, because if they can't explain it, maybe they don't know that well. It's like a professor who can't teach to an undergrad is not a good professor. So it's a bit the same thing. But if you manage to do it, in the end you can have discussions with informed citizens. So I think that's the extra legwork we need to do. But I'm lagging behind two questions, I always feel, because I was answering a previous question. I'll do it anyway. Your question was, how do we describe ourselves? How do we see ourselves? Yes. And then I started talking about design practice, because we make prototypes. But I think what for me changed a lot, or reassured us in a sense, was meetings I had with Ezio Manzini, who's a designer in Turin. We were invited to a short stint in Turin, and he explained us, well, he became famous for open-ended design. Was the idea, well, he always put it like error-friendly design. You start designing something, but hopefully there's something wrong about it, so you can improve it and maybe it becomes something else. And for me, that was very reassuring, because until then we were always justifying the outcomes, like we made this, but A famous example, I'll try to be less abstract for once, is we had the idea of creating a pavilion that captured rainwater and would transform it into drinking water. Sounds like a good idea. It's practically very difficult for many reasons. One, that you don't imagine, but it doesn't rain enough in Brussels to capture proper amounts of rainwater. And then rainwater is polluted. But at the time, the market is saturated now, but at the time there was no easy device to check rainwater quality electronically. You had these strips and gave you a pH, but it was very approximate. So we said, why not start building one ourselves? So from this water project, there was a fork splitting off into electronics. And we started to do a whole project on smart cities. Like, can we build a tool that captures rainwater? Which technology to use? Which protocols to use? And before you know it, we were meeting the head of the Smart Cities program of the Brussels region saying, why are citizens not talking about smart cities? So the end goal, the pavilion, it worked and we actually drank rainwater, but for a very short time. But the project that forked off, called the PACO test, started leading its own life and became rather influential in water management in Flanders. So from the idea of open-ended design, is if you wouldn't read it as open-ended design, it could be seen as a complete failure. You try to build a pavilion and you end up with a computer you build yourself. Failure. From our point of view, it's ultimate success because it forked off in something more relevant. So that's why we call ourselves a design practice and preferably an open-ended design practice.
It's often well framed by a Dutch guy called Hans Vermaak. He's like a so-called engineer of change in a way. And he puts it like what you see happening, even in processes of transition, what you see happening is most often very appropriate. But what actually really works most often is not appropriate at all. And I think that's where we want to go. We want to try something new. And so it's out in the ocean. It's in a space that is very contained. And so but there you should really go beyond the appropriate way of working.
What would you advise anyone who wants to reimagine cities and contribute to alternative futures?
I very much like the phrasing reimagine, because I think that touches the crux of it for me. Discussion we were having in the past days was, I think a lot of solutions are not tested because people can't imagine them, or practices that are not being done because people can't imagine that it's allowed, that it's possible, that it's doable. So reimagining cities starts for me from developing alternative narratives, other stories that people say this is so wacky, and it's very close to what I've been doing for the past 25 years. I've been seeing people who constantly say this is so wacky, I would not imagine drinking rainwater in Brussels. Is that possible? So we have a plethora of those interventions people call wacky, but the aim very often is to allow them to imagine that there is a world elsewhere. So that would be my first invitation, that do imagine, broaden your mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also think that once you believe that it is possible to make things better, that you're not stuck never actually. People are clever, people are resilient. That's our deep nature, I think. And so the sheer joy of being able to reimagine things is super, super important to develop, I think. Not to let you put in a corner. Bump into new insights, unexpected things. That's just pure joy.
Nice.
Even if it's very easy to make you believe that you're a fool. If you call things wacky, maybe the advantage of that, of making things that wacky, that people can see them as not dangerous actually, because people don't see how the possibility of imagining to drink rainwater and to make that actually happen could possibly shuffle power structures. So it has an innocent feel, it has an innocent frame, but actually the discussions you have to make things happen shuffle power structures.
I love that. Thank you so much. And
to add to that, a compliment I received when I worked in Belfast was somebody said, CityMine, they think so much outside the box. I don't think they know there is a box.
But really, I think this describes it very well, because that is really what you do. There's no box for you guys over there. Yeah. And coming to an end of this interview, where do you see CityMine go from here? You described in the beginning that you had different phases in your work over I believe 25 years you're working. What are the wishes for the next 10 years, and where do you go from here?
One of the difficulties we have as an organization is that we suffer a bit from the Peter Pan syndrome, where we like to stay small, and it defies all definitions of success. We've been through phases where we were an organization of 14 full-time people, but that's not what we wanted to do. And people say, wow, that was successful, not to us. And then at one point we had 4 CityMines in one in Brussels, one in London, one in Barcelona, and briefly one in Milan. It's like, well, ultimate success, franchising. I said, no, that's not what we wanted to do. And now we have a balance sheet that hardly reaches 300,000 every year. So it's a very small organization. But the difficulty is, how do you define success for yourself to say this is still, this has the integrity we wanted it to have, and success is that other people, success is not similar CityMines popping up all over Europe. Success is people with the same mindset popping up in different positions. That people who want to take this critical thought, this approach to urbanism, this inclusive approach to urbanism, human-centered, take that to positions of power. And I'm looking at you, Johannes. The important thing is that it's easy for us to kick and scream and say things have to go different. It's often very difficult to meet people who are willing to challenge the dominant discourse once they are in power, and to say, okay, we can think of this differently. And so that's one thing I would like to see in the future happen, that is be able to infuse people in places of power with a different way of thinking, with an open-ended way of thinking, with a participatory, inclusive way of governance. That's an important thing. And then on a very abstract level, what interests me a lot at the moment is following our work on energy communities. During a talk I gave in Oxford, I was approached by a professor who said, well, this for me is the ultimate example of the paradigm shift we need in transition. We should stop thinking about objects, and we have to start thinking about processes. We have to see the world as processes. And an energy community is not a local production center and consumption output. No, it's copper atoms bouncing against each other in a network which connects people who use it, but who are preferably also connected in other means, in other ways, so they can contact each other and talk to each other. By doing that, fine-tune their use of energy. And ever since he explained that to me, that was a real eye-opener, because we tend to see the world as objects. Even if we don't, we see projects as contained objects, and we see funding programs as a contained thing with a start, an arch, and a finish. And preferably at the start, you like to know the finish. But if you say, no, the funding is not the start and finish, the funding is everything that happens in between. We meet people, we bifurcate, we split off, we fork. And I think we're just at the start of this realization. But that is, if we could bring that into transition, we could also know that the ultimate aim is not a clean climate, because that doesn't exist. It's not a city without cars, because that doesn't exist. Or a perpetuum mobile economy, because that doesn't exist either. So rather than to hold our breath now, wait till it's finished, wait till every city is a 15-minute city, enjoy it while it's happening, and look at the process. I think that's the more abstract thought I wanted to share.
Thank you so much, Jim and Sophie. I love talking to you always when we have the chance. I really enjoyed this.
Likewise.
Thank you so much for being on the show, for taking your time. I think I will dive into the conversation one more time to unpack everything which was there. And there are a lot of forks, the forks you described, Jim, to go after for this podcast as well. This is a start. This is not an end of the conversation. And I would love to have you back on the show at a later stage again. Thank you so much for being here.
Great joy. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
This was my talk with Jim and Sophie from CityMine in Brussels. If you liked what you were hearing, please consider subscribing to Cities Reimagined on the podcast platform of your choice, or follow Cities Reimagined on Instagram to get more background stories and more making of content. Or send me an email at johannes@anthropocene.city with some feedback or some questions, or some wishes for the future of the show. In the next episode, I'm gonna talk to Jonas Bylund and Josephine Rangel, both from Sweden, and we're gonna talk about utopias and utopian urban futures. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to catch you soon.